The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Former U.S. President Ronald Reagan's comment from 1986 is still well known. It still resonates because there's at least some fundamental element of truth in it. Big outside bureaucratic institutions with their own agendas too often aren't helpful. Their involvement doesn't make things better. Welcome back, and thank you for wanting to know the facts and the truth. What's going on in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is big. You can't miss it on the news. You can't miss it on college campuses, and you really can't miss it online. But what are the facts? Why is this happening? That's what we're here to answer. Our approach is to examine the major themes and focus on the important events that help you make sense of what's happening today. We care about knowing the truth. We also care about the basic human right to live in peace. We care about ending the suffering. We care about finding justice. And we think you're here because you do too. The only path for us then is to go after the facts and be open to what they show us. Life can be beautiful without hatred, violence, and war, and maybe the way there starts with better understanding each other. Better understanding the Jewish people, the Palestinian people, the history of their conflicts and past peace efforts, and some of the major issues standing in the way of forging real peace. What the Hell is Going On in Gaza is a 9-part series made up of 30 episodes, each designed to help you understand a different but important part of the picture. Here in Part 7, we'll continue looking into the things that make the situation much, much worse. They are real problems that have a really significant effect. In Episode 27, we'll talk about the United Nations and non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, and the role they've played in the Israeli-Palestinian situation. Let's jump in. Ever since issuing its partition plan in 1947, the United Nations has played a major role in the affairs of the region. Today, it is the UN Special Agency for Palestinian Refugees that deserves to be in the spotlight, as it has made the situation between Israel and Palestinians much worse. At the same time, it has itself contributed to the plight of Palestinians. One very significant problem is that UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, determined and maintained a definition of refugees that has caused real problems, both for the situation and for Palestinians. UNRWA's definition of a refugee perpetuates the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. One might ask why UNRWA operates at 8 refugee camps in Gaza when Israel disengaged and left Gaza almost 20 years ago. Let's look at some of the history behind UNRWA and how it's different than the UNHRC, the United Nations Human Rights Committee, which is responsible for all refugees in the world, except Palestinian refugees. Shortly after its founding in the aftermath of World War II, the UN sought to help some 60 million displaced refugees. It created the UNHRC and defined refugees as, quote, persons who are outside their country of origin for reasons of feared persecution, conflict, generalized violence, or other circumstances that have seriously disturbed public order and, as a result, require international protection. In the aftermath of the Arabs' failed 1948 war against Israel, the UN sought to help approximately 700,000 displaced Arabs in Palestine. It created UNRWA and added a new concept to the UNHRC's definition of refugees. UNRWA's definition includes all descendants of male refugees, including their adopted children, and even people who have been granted citizenship in another country. The UN's approach raises some important questions. Why was it necessary or appropriate for UNRWA to create and maintain a dramatically broader definition of refugee than the UNHRC? Isn't it meaningful that the UN not consider the 900,000 Jews who fled or were expelled from Arab states to be refugees? Isn't this evidence that the UN considered Israel to be their homeland and therefore a satisfactory solution? If not, how many Jewish refugees would there be if the 900,000 Jews forced out of Arab countries were classified as refugees using UNRWA's definition? How many Jewish refugees would there be around the world if descendants of the Jews displaced by World War II were classified as refugees using UNRWA's definition? Why is there special consideration for Palestinians but not for Jews who had everything taken from them and were scattered to the four corners of the world? The big issue that's most relevant to our discussion, though, is just that UNRWA established a unique definition of Palestinian refugees that allowed their number to grow from 700,000 to 5.9 million. Whether that was done with good intentions or to achieve a political purpose doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that it's a big problem. This special Palestinians-only definition has ensured that there cannot both be a right of return and a democratic state where Jews have a right of self-determination. The UNRWA-created explosion in the number of Palestinian refugees created a fundamental impediment to peace with Israel. Another very significant problem is that UNRWA has evolved to become an organization that teaches hate. The Jerusalem Post reported that a former UNRWA official exposed that the leader of Hamas was an UNRWA teacher and that UNRWA schools teach Palestinian children to hate Jews, as reported by Impact SE, an organization that analyzes school books and curricula for compliance with UNESCO-defined standards on peace and tolerance. The article states that UNRWA textbooks are, quote, openly anti-Semitic and continue to encourage violence, jihad, and martyrdom, while peace is not taught as preferable or even possible. Extreme nationalism and Islamist ideologies proliferate throughout the curriculum, including in science and math textbooks. Some examples of incendiary and anti-Semitic educational material include a reading comprehension exercise celebrating a Palestinian firebombing attack on a Jewish bus as a, quote, barbecue party, and material glorifying Dalal Mughrabi, a terrorist who murdered 38 Israeli civilians in the 1978 Coastal Road Massacre, as a role model for children. This image shows a report on UNRWA teachers' incitement to jihadist terrorism and anti-Semitism that was presented by UN Watch to the US Congress. It cites 40 examples of UNRWA teachers' conduct. UN Watch had provided 30 other examples 2 years earlier. For this to be going on, and for it to be by a United Nations agency that's supposed to be helping what has become a terrible situation for both Palestinians and Israelis, is unconscionable. How can Palestinians be expected to move toward peace with Israel if they continue to be indoctrinated in hate? Let's shift our focus now to NGOs, non-governmental organizations. The sad reality is that many NGOs knew Hamas was in the Al-Shifa hospital, yet repeatedly denied it. It's hard to say why Doctors Without Borders, the Red Cross, and others, really any relief or aid group that spent time in that hospital and therefore must have known the truth, didn't admit it. Maybe they felt they could help more people by lying so they wouldn't be banned. Maybe they believed Israel was in the wrong and so it was okay to lie for Hamas. Either way, those lies made them complicit in terrorism. Those lies distorted media coverage and world perception. Those lies contributed to the terrible course this conflict has taken. NGO Monitor reported that Doctors Without Borders, quote, repeatedly denied that Hamas was present in Gaza hospitals, claiming that, quote, we have seen no evidence that the hospital buildings or the compounds are being used by Hamas as a military base. Instead, the NGO alleged that Israel was, quote, attacking healthcare. Based on the extensive evidence produced by Israel to Hamas's systematic exploitation of Al-Shifa Hospital and other medical facilities, it is impossible that MSF staff and volunteers were unaware of the reality. CAMRA, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, reported on testimony by a former Palestinian hospital director about Hamas's use of hospitals as bases for their operations. Quote, the extent to which hospitals have been taken over by the Hamas terrorist organization has not only become clearer from the recently released testimony of Dr. Ahmed Kolat, the director of the Kamal Adwan Hospital in Jabalia, who holds the rank of lieutenant colonel in Hamas's military wing. He told Shin Bet and IDF interrogators that, quote, the hospital is controlled by Hamas, and that, quote, there are workers in the hospital who are military operatives of Izz al-Din al-Qassam, including physicians, nurses, paramedics, clerks, and staff members, as well as employees from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, another terrorist group. He explained that Hamas operatives hide in hospitals because they believe them to be safe spaces where they will not be harmed. He described, quote, offices for senior officials, designated places for interrogations, internal security, and special security, and private phone lines within the hospital for Hamas officials. Since the late 1990s, human rights NGOs such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have continuously tried to delegitimize and undermine Israel. Their constant criticism, regardless of the facts, including the use of terms like apartheid and genocide, foster views of Israel that are objectively false. On October 21st, Human Rights Watch executive Ken Roth tweeted, quote, the oppressive discrimination that the Israeli government imposes on millions of Palestinians in occupied territory, the apartheid, does not begin to be justified by security concerns. It is about dominance, land grabs, and demographic engineering. We've already established that it's false to call Israel an apartheid state. And further, characterizing Israel's response to Hamas's horrific attacks by saying it's about dominance or land grabs or demographic engineering is shameful. No doubt, though, the soft power of Human Rights Watch lends considerable credibility to their biased and false claims. Amnesty International's actions are pretty similar. On October 9th, Amnesty International's Senior Director for Research, Advocacy, Policy, and Campaigns, Erica Guevara Rosas, tweeted, quote, Israel, collective punishment is a war crime. The use of starvation as a weapon of war is also a war crime. The international community must denounce these abhorrent calls in the strongest possible terms. Retaliating against an attack from Gaza by Gaza's elected government, which had kidnapped and was holding Israeli citizens hostage in Gaza, is neither collective punishment nor a war crime. And how does purposely killing Israeli civilians for offenses allegedly committed by the Israeli government not count as collective punishment? Where is the outrage about that? Lastly, as we covered earlier, Israel is not using starvation as a weapon of war. On October 17th, Amnesty International tweeted, quote, the French government has banned all demonstrations in support of Palestinians' rights. This constitutes a serious and disproportionate attack on the right to demonstrate. Under international law, a ban on demonstrations must be considered as a last resort. So, not only does Amnesty weigh in constantly on everything Israel does or is alleged to have done, it even weighs in when other countries support Israel, or in this case, take steps to combat anti-Semitism. These are just a few examples. Sadly, there are many, many more. Anything less than objectivity from the media is bias that distorts the perceptions of viewers and readers around the world, not just ordinary people, but governments too. It fosters in Israel a we have to go it alone mentality, and it emboldens those who would attack Israel. Both are escalatory effects. That is definitely not constructive. It doesn't bring Israelis and Palestinians closer to peace. It only does the opposite. Thank you for watching episode 27 of our series, What the Hell is Going On in Gaza? We hope you got a better understanding of how the United Nations and NGOs have for some time and continue to make things worse in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Let's review what we learned here in part 7 of our series. We learned that religious extremism is poison. Islamists seek to create oppressive religious regimes and use violence to achieve their goals. They do not care about the deaths of their own people, let alone their enemies' people. Israeli extremists, while not comparable at all to Islamist extremists, are responsible for expanding settlements in Palestinian territories, bigotry, and are a significant impediment to peace. We learned that the media too often is irresponsible and biased in their reporting, which inflames hatred, triggers violence, and undermines the possibility of achieving peace. We learned that the United Nations, particularly UNRWA, is responsible for perpetuating Palestinians' unhappy condition as refugees, for lying to protect terrorists, and for teaching hatred and division to even the youngest children, which serves only to fuel the radicalization of Palestinian society. The role and contribution of the UN and NGOs has been a disaster for the Palestinian and Israeli people. If you'd like to leave a comment or get in touch, visit our website at www.getthefactsmiddleeast.com. We hope you'll keep going and watch Part 8, where we'll look at whether peace is possible and what it might take to become a reality. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate your interest in learning more about the war in Gaza. And remember, where there is no knowledge, there can be no insight.